My parents gave my twin sister away at birth and never told me. I was reaching for avocados when I saw my own face staring back at me from across the produce section. We stared at each other. Identical shock on our faces. "I'm adopted," she said immediately, like that explained everything. "I'm not," I replied. We sat in the Starbucks inside the store comparing birthmarks and baby photos she had from her adoption file. Same birthday, same hospital. "My parents told me my birth mother was a teenager," Maria said. I showed her photos of my mom and dad. "We need to talk to them," I said. I drove to my parents' house with my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. Everything I thought I knew about my life was crumbling. When my mother opened the door, I held up my phone with a picture of Maria and I together and watched her face collapse. "You had twins," I said, my voice breaking. "You had twins, and you gave one away, and you never told me." My father came up behind her and went white when he saw what I was showing them. "How could you lie to me for 23 years? I was screaming now. Years of being the perfect only child exploding out of me. Every birthday, every Christmas, I had a sister out there and you knew. You knew. My mother was crying, but I didn't care. "We were drowning in debt," she said. "Dad's business hadn't taken off yet. We could barely afford one baby." My father tried his rational voice that usually calmed me down. "The adoption agency promised she'd go to a good family. We thought we were doing the right thing." "The right thing?" I laughed bitterly. "The right thing would have been telling me I had a twin sister. The right thing would have been keeping us together." I thought about every time I'd begged them for a sibling. Every time they'd said maybe someday, knowing the whole time that my sister existed somewhere else. "You let me be lonely my whole childhood when I had a twin. Do you understand what you stole from both of us?" They didn't have an answer that could fix 23 years of lies. I left and picked up Maria, bringing her back to meet them properly. She wasn't angry like I was, just sad. "I had good parents," she said quietly. "They died in a car accident 2 years ago." My mother started crying and reached for Maria's hand. "I'm so sorry. We thought about you every single day." Maria let her hold her hand, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. Over the next few weeks, Maria and I became inseparable. She was funny in ways I wasn't, bold where I was careful. She'd traveled all over on barely any money while I'd stayed safe in my bubble. We stayed up talking about the same recurring dreams we both had about swimming in a green pool, which turned out to be the view from our birth hospital room. She moved into my apartment temporarily when her lease ended, and my roommate loved her immediately. Maria made everyone laugh with her impressions and stories from her job at the animal shelter. She fit into my friend group perfectly. Even better than I did sometimes. "You're the fun twin," my best friend Rachel joked, and I pretended it didn't sting because I was so happy to have her in my life. She started asking me to tell her everything about growing up with our parents, what traditions we had, what mom made for breakfast on Saturdays, how dad tucked me in when I was little. I loved sharing it all with her. Loved seeing her face light up when I described Christmas mornings or family vacations. She asked to see all our photo albums, and we spent entire weekends going through them. "Show me your room," she said one day. "Your childhood room at your parents' house." We drove over while they were at work and I gave her the full tour. She touched everything carefully, like it was a museum. "I always wondered what my room would have looked like," she said. She started picking up my mannerisms, the way I tucked my hair behind my ear, how I laughed. It was sweet, like she was trying to find the similarities between us. When she bought the same perfume I wore, she said, "I want to know if we would have picked the same things if we'd grown up together." She was healing something in me I didn't know was broken, the loneliness of being an only child. One evening we were making dinner at my parents' house while they were out. Maria knew where everything was by then, moved through the kitchen like she'd grown up there. She was asking about their schedules, when they traveled for work, what their daily routines were. "I want to surprise them with breakfast sometime," she said. "What time does mom wake up? Does dad still take those sleeping pills you mentioned?" I was telling her all about their morning habits when she got a text that made her face change. She stepped onto the patio to make a call and I could hear her through the window I'd cracked earlier to let the cooking smoke out. "I know everything now," she was saying. "Their schedules, their medications, Georgette's signatures. She trusts me completely." She paused, listening, then continued. "Tomorrow when she's at work, I'll go to the house with the spare key she gave me. I'll take what I need to become her. They chose her over me, but soon they won't even know they have the wrong daughter. Georgette can have my life, what's left of it, while I take back the 23 years they stole from me." I stood frozen on the patio, my whole body locked up while Maria kept talking inside. My phone was in my pocket and my hands wouldn't stop shaking as I pulled it out. I opened the voice recorder app and held it up to the cracked window, making sure the microphone caught every word she said. She was still going, talking about timing and access and how easy it would be. I watched her through the glass, pacing back and forth in the kitchen, and she looked so calm. My twin sister, my own face, planning to erase me. The recording counter ticked up to 3 minutes, then 4. Finally, she said goodbye and hung up. I shoved my phone in my pocket and tried to make my face look normal. My legs felt weird and disconnected as I walked back inside. Maria turned around smiling like nothing happened. She asked if I wanted to help her make dessert, something with strawberries. I said sure and picked up the knife she handed me. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped it. The strawberries blurred in front of me while I tried to cut them into normal-looking pieces. Maria chatted about her day at the animal shelter. Some story about a dog that kept escaping its kennel. I made myself laugh at the right parts. Every second felt like hours. I kept thinking about her voice on that call. So cold and planned out. After 10 minutes, I told her I felt sick, which wasn't even a lie. My stomach hurt and my head was pounding. She looked concerned and touched my forehead to check for fever. Her hand felt exactly like mine would. I pulled away and said I should go home and rest. She hugged me goodbye and told me to feel better. I grabbed my purse and walked to my car, forcing myself not to run. The drive to Amaya's work took 15 minutes but felt like forever. I sat in the parking lot outside the restaurant where she waitressed, watching the clock on my dashboard. Her shift ended at 9. I kept checking my phone to make sure the recording was still there, playing the first few seconds over and over. At 9:03, she came out the side door in her regular clothes. I flashed my headlights and she walked over looking confused. She got in the passenger seat asking what was wrong. I didn't say anything, just pulled up the recording and hit play. Her face changed as she listened. First confused, then shocked, then scared. The recording played Maria's voice talking about schedules and medications and signatures. When it got to the part about taking what she needed to become me, Amaya grabbed my arm. She said we needed to tell my parents right now, tonight. I shook my head and told her they wouldn't believe me. Maria was so good at seeming sweet and sad. They felt so guilty about giving her away. Amaya argued, but I could see her thinking about it, realizing I might be right. She said we should at least tell Rachel. I agreed and started driving toward Rachel's apartment across town. Amaya kept playing the recording again, her face getting harder each time. Rachel answered her door in pajamas, clearly about to go to bed. One look at our faces and she pulled us inside. I played the recording for the 3rd time that night. Rachel's jaw got tight and her eyes went scary calm, the way they did when she was really mad. She grabbed a notebook from her kitchen counter and started making a list. She said we needed to secure everything right now, tonight, before Maria could do anything. She wrote down documents, passwords, bank accounts, credit cards. Then she added the spare key I'd given Maria to my apartment. My stomach dropped again. I'd completely forgotten about that key. Rachel asked what else Maria had access to. I told them about showing her my childhood room, my parents' house, all the photo albums. Rachel wrote it all down. She said we needed to change every password I had and set up alerts on everything. Amaya suggested we make copies of my important documents and put them somewhere safe, somewhere Maria didn't know about. Rachel nodded and added it to the list. She looked at me and said we were doing this now, all of it, before any of us went to sleep. The 3 of us spent the next 2 hours crowded around Rachel's laptop. She pulled up every account I could think of. Email, social media, bank accounts, credit cards, my work portal, everything. I changed each password to something random that Rachel wrote down in her notebook. She made me set up 2-factor authentication on all of them, the kind that sends a code to my phone. My fingers hurt from typing by the time we finished. Rachel pulled up the credit monitoring websites and helped me set up alerts for any new applications or inquiries. Amaya found a FedEx that was still open and we drove there at 11 at night. I made copies of my driver's license, social security card, birth certificate, and passport. Amaya paid for a small safe deposit box at her bank, and we put the copies there the next morning. Back at Rachel's place, she made me write down everywhere Maria had been, everyone she'd met, everything I'd told her. The list got longer and longer. She knew my work schedule, my regular coffee shop, my gym, my parents' address, and their daily routines. She'd met most of my friends. She had my phone number and email. She knew what car I drove and where I parked it. Rachel looked at the list and said we needed to change as much of this as possible. I felt sick again realizing how much access I'd given her. I barely slept that night after Rachel finally sent me home at 2 in the morning. Every sound made me jump awake. I checked that my door was locked 5 times before I even got in bed. Then I got up twice more to check it again. The recording played in my head over and over. Maria's voice so calm and sure, like she'd been planning this for weeks. Maybe she had been. Maybe from the moment we met in that grocery store, she'd been figuring out how to take my place. I thought about all those questions she'd asked, the way she studied my mannerisms, bought the same perfume. It wasn't sweet. It was research. She was learning how to be me. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and just lay there staring at the ceiling. My phone was clutched in my hand with the recording app still open. I kept thinking about her saying they chose me over her. Like our parents had picked favorites. Like I was the winner and she deserved revenge. The sky started getting light around 6 and I still hadn't slept at all. In the morning, I called my boss and told her I had the flu. My voice sounded rough enough that she believed me without questions. I made coffee and opened my laptop, then spent 3 hours reading everything I could find about identity theft protection. Most of the articles talked about strangers stealing credit card numbers or social security information. Nothing about identical twin sisters who knew everything about your life. I read about credit freezes and fraud alerts and police reports. I learned that identity theft was hard to prove until after someone actually used your information. The legal advice forum said to document everything, which I was already doing. One article mentioned that family member identity theft was the hardest kind to fight because they had legitimate access to so much information. I felt more hopeless the more I read. Around noon, Amaya texted asking how I was doing. I told her I couldn't stop reading about identity theft. She said to take a break and eat something. I realized I hadn't eaten since the strawberries at my parents' house the night before. I finally worked up the courage to call my parents around 2 in the afternoon. My hands shook while I dialed. Dad answered and I asked if I could come over alone to talk about something serious. He asked if Maria would be there. I said no, just them, and I needed it to be soon. He put Mom on the phone and she sounded worried immediately. She asked if I was okay, if something happened. I almost started crying right there but held it together. I told her I was fine, but I really needed to talk to them both today. She said to come over now, they'd be waiting. I hung up and sat in my car for 10 minutes trying to calm down. My face in the rearview mirror looked awful. Dark circles under my eyes and skin too pale. I looked exactly like Maria probably looked. That thought made everything worse. When I arrived at their house, both of them were sitting at the kitchen table looking anxious. I could see the guilt on their faces before I even said anything. They knew something was wrong. I sat down across from them and put my phone on the table. My hands were shaking again. I pulled up the recording and turned the volume all the way up. Then I pressed play. Maria's voice filled the kitchen talking about schedules and medications and signatures. Mom's face went white. The recording kept playing. Maria talking about the spare key, about taking what she needed to become me. Dad gripped the edge of the table. When it got to the part about them choosing me over her, about Georgette having her life, Mom made a small sound like something hurt. The recording ended. Nobody moved. I watched their faces crumble, both of them looking like I'd hit them. The silence felt huge and terrible. Finally, Mom started crying. My mother kept saying she knew something was wrong, but wanted to believe Maria just needed time to adjust. She said Maria seemed so sweet and grateful to have a family. Dad sat completely still and pale like he might throw up. He asked to hear the recording again. I played it. He closed his eyes while it played. His jaw clenched tight. When it ended, he asked to hear it one more time. I played it a third time. This time they both listened with their heads down, not looking at me or each other. When it finished, Mom was crying harder. She kept saying she was sorry, she didn't know, she thought Maria was healing. Dad finally looked at me and I could see he believed it now, believed that Maria was dangerous. He asked when I recorded this. I told them last night at their house while Maria was on the patio. Mom's face changed. She asked if Maria knew I'd heard. I shook my head. They both looked at each other and something passed between them. Some shared guilt that went back 23 years to the day they gave her away. Dad finally spoke, his voice rough and quiet. He said Maria asked for the spare key last week when she stopped by while I was at work. She told him she wanted to surprise us with breakfast one morning, make pancakes like she used to with her adoptive parents. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might throw up right there at their kitchen table. She had the key for a whole week. 7 days of access to their house, their medicine cabinet, their filing cabinets with all their personal papers. 7 days to copy signatures, photograph documents, learn their routines down to the minute. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself. Mom was still crying, but I couldn't comfort her. Couldn't comfort anyone when my whole body felt like it was shaking apart. I started talking fast, listing everything I'd noticed over the past few weeks that I'd ignored because I was so desperate to have a sister. How Maria asked specific questions about their morning routines, what time they each woke up, which days they worked from home. How she studied the way Mom signed her name on birthday cards, practiced it on scrap paper while we looked through photo albums. How she knew where they kept their insurance papers, their bank statements, their medication bottles. Mom kept interrupting me with things like, but she seemed so sweet, and she's been through so much losing her parents. Each excuse made me want to scream. I asked Mom if she understood that Maria wasn't just sad or curious. She was planning something dangerous. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out to see a text from Rachel. She said she called a lawyer friend who told her I needed to file a police report immediately, even if no crime happened yet, to create a paper trail. I showed my parents the text. Dad's face went hard and he said absolutely not, that involving police would destroy any chance of fixing this as a family. I laughed, a bitter sound that didn't feel like it came from me. I told him there was no family to fix, that Maria made that clear on her phone call. Mom reached across the table trying to grab my hand, but I pulled away. She started begging me to let them talk to Maria first, to give her a chance to explain before I did anything legal. She said Maria deserved that much after everything she'd lost. I stared at my mother and felt something break inside me. They were still choosing to protect Maria's feelings over my actual safety. The old wound of being the one they kept while she got given away had somehow made them desperate to make it up to her, even if it meant sacrificing me. I stood up from the table so fast my chair scraped loud against the floor. I told them they had 24 hours to get that spare key back from Maria and change their locks. If they didn't, I was filing a police report and cutting contact with all of them. Dad looked like I'd slapped him across the face. Mom's crying got harder, her whole body shaking. But she nodded slowly and said she understood why I needed to protect myself. I walked out without saying goodbye. My hands were shaking. So bad I could barely get my car keys out of my pocket. I drove straight to a locksmith shop I'd passed 100 times but never noticed before. The guy behind the counter looked bored until I told him I needed my apartment locks changed right now, today, immediately. He must have seen something in my face because he didn't argue about appointments or schedules. He grabbed his tools and followed me to my apartment. It took him 30 minutes to change both locks, the front door and the back patio door I'd never worried about before. He gave me 3 sets of new keys, and I paid him in cash because I didn't want any record of the transaction on my credit card that Maria might somehow see. After he left, I sat on my couch staring at the new keys in my hand. They felt heavy, like they weighed more than regular keys should. I texted Amaya to let her know about the lock change and that I'd leave her new key under the mat. She texted back immediately asking what was wrong, why I changed the locks without telling her first. I sent her a voice message because I couldn't type it all out. I told her about the recording, about Maria's plan, about everything. She called me right away, but I didn't answer. I couldn't talk about it again, couldn't say the words out loud one more time. When Amaya got home from work 2 hours later, she found me still sitting on the couch in the same position. She didn't say anything, just sat down next to me and pulled me into a hug. That's when I finally let myself cry. Really cry. Not the angry tears from earlier, but deep sobs that hurt my chest. I cried for the sister I thought I'd found, and the family I thought we'd build together. Amaya held me and didn't try to make it better with words, just let me fall apart. That night around 9, my phone lit up with a text from Maria. She asked if I wanted to get lunch tomorrow, suggested this Thai place we'd been to before, used 3 smiley face emojis like everything was completely normal. My stomach turned reading it. She had no idea I'd overheard her call. No idea I knew what she was planning. I showed the text to Amaya and she said it was creepy how normal Maria was acting. I started typing a response, but then Rachel called. She told me not to respond to Maria yet, to let my parents deal with her first and see what happened. She said anything I said to Maria now could be used against me later if this got legal. I deleted my half-written response and put my phone face down on the coffee table. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the apartment made me jump. I kept checking that the front door was locked, that the new locks were working, that the windows were secure. Amaya heard me getting up and down and came out of her room around 3 in the morning. She made us both tea and we sat in the kitchen not really talking, just being awake together. The next morning my phone rang at 8 and I saw Mom's name on the screen. My whole body tensed up before I even answered. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She said they confronted Maria last night, went to her apartment and played her the recording. Maria denied everything. She claimed the phone call was just her venting to a friend about feeling left out of the family, that I'd misunderstood because I only heard part of the conversation. She said she never meant any of it, that she was just upset and saying things she didn't mean. Mom said Maria gave back the spare key but acted really hurt that they would accuse her of planning something bad after she'd been nothing but loving. I asked Mom point blank if she actually believed Maria's story. There was a long silence on the phone. Finally, Mom admitted in a small voice that she didn't know what to believe anymore. Everything Maria said sounded reasonable, but the recording was so specific, so detailed. Dad got on the phone then, and his voice was firm. He said they were changing the locks today no matter what, that he'd already called a locksmith. It was something at least. I thanked him and hung up. An hour later, Maria called me directly for the first time since the whole thing started. Her voice was shaking when she said my parents were turning against her based on a misunderstanding. She said I was being paranoid and cruel, that she'd never had a real family and I was destroying her only chance at one. She said she knew I'd always been jealous of how easily she fit in with my friends, how much everyone liked her. Part of me almost felt guilty listening to her cry. Then I remembered her exact words on that patio call, how she said she'd take what she needed to become me, how I could have her life while she took back the 23 years that got stolen from her. I told Maria I needed to go and ended the call. My hands were shaking again. I picked up my phone and called Maria back, my finger hovering over her contact for a full minute before I pressed it. She answered on the first ring. I kept my voice as steady as I could manage and told her I needed some space to process everything that had happened, that I thought it would be best if we didn't contact each other for a while. The line went quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up, but then she spoke in this flat, cold tone that made my skin crawl. She said fine, if that's what I wanted, and the phone went dead without a goodbye. I sat there staring at my screen, that last word echoing in my head. Rachel showed up an hour later with 2 bottles of wine and her laptop under her arm. She'd already started researching identity theft protection before she even got to my place. We sat at my kitchen table and she pulled up articles about securing accounts, checking for tracking devices, monitoring credit reports. She made me change the route I take to work every day, told me to check under my car for GPS trackers, set up alerts on all my financial accounts. We backed up the recording to 3 different cloud services and emailed copies to her personal account just in case. It felt crazy and paranoid, like we were preparing for some kind of spy movie scenario, but Rachel kept saying better safe than sorry. She wrote everything down in a list and made me promise to follow every single step. The whole time my stomach was churning because I couldn't shake the feeling that Maria wasn't going to just accept my boundaries and move on. 2 days later, I was at work when my phone buzzed with an alert from my bank. Someone had tried to log into my account from a device I didn't recognize, from an IP address in a part of town I never go to. The two-factor authentication had blocked them, but seeing that notification made my heart drop into my stomach. I knew immediately it was her. I took screenshots of everything, the login attempt, the location, the timestamp. When I got home that night, I created a new folder on my laptop and labeled it Evidence, feeling like I was living in some crime drama instead of my actual life. Every new file I added to that folder made the whole situation feel more real and more terrifying. The next morning, Amaya mentioned over breakfast that Maria hadn't shown up for her last 3 shifts at the animal shelter. Her coworkers were calling around trying to find her, worried something had happened. Amaya thought I'd be relieved to hear Maria was staying away, but it had the opposite effect. If she wasn't at work, what was she doing with all that time? Was she planning something bigger than just trying to log into my bank account? The not knowing made everything worse. My mother called me that afternoon while I was sitting in a meeting at work. I stepped out into the hallway to answer, and she was already crying. She said they'd had the locks changed like they promised, and yesterday Maria had shown up at their house demanding to know why they didn't trust her anymore. Mom said Maria made a huge scene right there on their front porch, crying and screaming that they were choosing me over her just like they did when we were born. The neighbors came out to see what was happening before Maria finally got in her car and drove away. My father got on the phone then, and his voice was shaking when he told me they'd done the right thing changing those locks. I could hear the guilt eating at both of them, but I was glad they'd actually followed through. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every small sound in the apartment made me jump. I kept getting up to check that the door was locked, that the new locks were working properly, that all the windows were secure. Around 3 in the morning, Amaya heard me moving around and came out of her room. She made us both tea, and we sat in the kitchen not really talking, just being awake together in the quiet. When the sun finally came up, I called a therapist's office that Rachel had recommended. The receptionist said Brianna Haynes specialized in family trauma and had an opening later that week. I took it immediately, knowing I needed professional help to deal with all of this. I couldn't keep jumping at shadows and losing sleep and feeling like my whole life was falling apart. The day of my first appointment, I almost canceled twice. Sitting in that waiting room felt like admitting I couldn't handle my own problems. But when Brianna called me back to her office and I started telling her everything, she just listened without judgment. She said what I was going through was a unique kind of betrayal trauma, made more complicated by the justified guilt I felt about the adoption situation. She told me that protecting myself from Maria didn't make me a cruel person, even though Maria's pain about being given up was real and understandable. Hearing someone validate that I wasn't wrong to set boundaries made me cry harder than I had since this whole thing started. A few days later, I started seeing Maria's posts on social media. She wasn't naming anyone directly, but it was obvious what she was talking about. Vague posts about being rejected by the people who were supposed to love you, about families who abandon you twice, about discovering that blood doesn't actually mean anything. Several of my friends texted me asking what was going on, if everything was okay with my family. I didn't respond to any of them publicly because I didn't want to add fuel to whatever fire Maria was trying to start, but the humiliation of having our private family drama visible to everyone made everything so much worse. My father called a week later and asked if I could meet him for coffee, just the two of us, without telling my mother. That was strange because my parents never kept secrets from each other about anything. When I met him at the coffee shop near his office, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past month. His eyes had dark circles under them, and his hands shook slightly when he picked up his cup. He admitted he'd been having nightmares about the day they gave Maria away, that it was all coming back now that she'd reappeared in their lives. I asked him what he meant by nightmares, and he looked down at his coffee for a long time before answering. He finally told me the truth about why they'd given Maria up, and it wasn't just about the money like my mother had said. Mom had severe postpartum depression after having twins. The doctor told them she might not survive mentally or physically if they tried to keep both babies. They were drowning financially and emotionally, and the choice came down to potentially losing my mother, or placing one baby for adoption. Dad said he'd made the final decision because Mom couldn't, and he'd carried the guilt of that choice for 23 years. Now it was destroying their marriage because all those old wounds had been ripped open again. I sat there listening to him and felt my anger start to shift into something more complicated, understanding that their decision had come from desperation and fear rather than not wanting Maria. But it still didn't change what Maria was doing now, didn't make her attempts to steal my identity any less dangerous or wrong. I reached across the coffee shop table and put my hand on Dad's. He looked up at me with red eyes, and I could see how much this had been eating at him for over 2 decades. I told him I understood now that the choice they made came from a place of fear and desperation, not cruelty, and I could see his shoulders relax slightly. But I also told him their past pain didn't mean I had to let Maria steal my identity now, that I still needed to protect myself even if it hurt everyone involved. He nodded slowly and squeezed my hand back, admitting that I was right to set boundaries, and that he'd support whatever I needed to do to stay safe. We sat there for another few minutes in silence before I drove home, feeling like something had shifted between us, even though nothing was actually fixed. That afternoon, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and when I answered, A woman from my credit card company asked if I'd recently applied for a new card at 3 different stores. My blood went cold and I told her no. I hadn't been to any of those places. She explained that someone had tried to open new accounts using my information, but the applications got flagged because the signatures didn't quite match what they had on file. I thanked her for catching it and asked her to put extra security on my accounts, then sat on my couch staring at my phone and trying not to panic. Maria was actually doing it, actually trying to steal my identity piece by piece. I called Amaya at work and told her what happened, and she said I needed to go to the police right now. Not tomorrow or next week, but today. I grabbed my laptop with all the evidence Rachel had helped me organize and drove to the police station with my hands shaking on the wheel. The officer at the front desk directed me to Detective Edwin Browning, a tired-looking man in his 40s who listened carefully as I explained everything. I showed him the recording of Maria's phone call, the bank login attempts, the credit card fraud alerts, screenshots of her social media posts, and statements from my parents about the spare key incident. He took notes on everything and said he understood why I was scared, but then came the part I'd been dreading. He explained that until Maria actually succeeded in stealing my identity or made direct threats against me, there was limited action the police could take right now. I felt my frustration rising and asked what I was supposed to do. Just wait until she actually ruined my life before anyone would help. Browning looked sympathetic and suggested I document absolutely everything. Consider getting a restraining order if Maria contacted me again, and look into civil options for harassment since the criminal system had its hands tied. It felt completely backward that the system couldn't protect me until after the damage was done, but at least now there was an official police report on file. He gave me his card and told me to call immediately if anything else happened, then walked me out to the parking lot where I sat in my car and cried for 10 minutes. The next morning, I returned to work after being out sick for 3 days, and my supervisor, Amy Hall, pulled me into her office before I even got to my desk. She closed the door and asked if everything was okay at home, then told me someone had called yesterday pretending to be me and trying to get information about my employment and salary. Amy said she didn't give out any details and immediately flagged my employee file, but the caller had known enough personal information to be convincing at first. I felt violated all over again knowing that Maria was actively trying to infiltrate my professional life now, not just my personal accounts. Amy assured me she'd put a note in the system that any calls about me needed to be verified through multiple channels, and I thanked her while trying not to break down crying in front of my boss. That afternoon, I had my regular therapy appointment with Brianna, and I spent the first 20 minutes just venting about how powerless I felt. She listened and validated my feelings, then suggested we work on a script for setting boundaries with my parents, since they were still the weakest link in my security. We spent the rest of the session writing out exactly what I needed to say, explaining that I needed them to stop sharing any information about me with Maria, and to actively support my safety over Maria's feelings. Brianna kept reminding me that healthy boundaries weren't punishment, they were protection, and I shouldn't feel guilty for doing what I needed to survive this. The script felt harsh when I read it back, but Brianna assured me it was appropriate given what Maria had done and was still trying to do. 2 days later, I drove to my parents' house and asked them both to sit down because I had something important to say. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the script Brianna had helped me write, but I forced myself to read it out loud without stopping. I told them I loved them, but I couldn't have a relationship with them if they continued having any contact with Maria while she was actively trying to harm me. I said I needed them to promise not to share any information about my life, my schedule, my work, or my plans with Maria going forward, and that if they couldn't do that, then I'd have to step back from our relationship entirely. My mother started crying before I even finished, saying she felt like she was losing both daughters now after just getting Maria back. Dad put his arm around her and looked at me with such sadness that I almost took it all back, but I remembered Brianna's words about boundaries being protection. They both agreed to my terms and promised not to share anything about my life with Maria, and Mom reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I left feeling relieved but also guilty, like I was forcing them to choose between their daughters all over again. That night, I got an email from Maria with the subject line, "Can we talk?" And my stomach dropped before I even opened it. The email started apologetic, saying she understood I was scared and she wanted to explain everything, but by the third paragraph, it turned accusatory. She wrote that I was being dramatic, and she never actually meant to go through with anything, that it was just fantasy talk with a friend to process her feelings of abandonment. She said I'd poisoned our parents against her and destroyed her only chance at having a family, and that I should be ashamed of myself for treating her like a criminal when she'd done nothing wrong. The email ended with her saying she hoped I could live with myself knowing I'd rejected her twice now, just like our parents did at birth. I read it 3 times feeling a mix of anger and guilt, then forwarded it directly to Detective Browning without responding to Maria at all. He called me back within an hour and said to keep saving everything, but the email still wasn't quite enough for criminal charges since she claimed it was all just talk. He suggested I consult with an attorney about getting a civil restraining order, which might be easier to obtain than waiting for the criminal system to catch up. I thanked him and hung up feeling exhausted, wondering how much more evidence I'd need before anyone could actually stop Maria from whatever she was planning next. Rachel gave me Bailey Jackson's number the next morning and I called her office right away. Bailey met with me that afternoon in a small conference room that smelled like coffee and old paper. I spread out everything I had on the table between us while my hands shook so badly I almost dropped my phone twice. She listened to the recording 3 times with her eyes closed, then went through each bank alert and credit card attempt with a yellow highlighter. Bailey was maybe 40 with gray streaks in her dark hair and reading glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She looked up at me after reviewing the email Maria sent and nodded slowly. She said I had a decent case for a restraining order based on the identity theft attempts and the harassing contact, but she needed me to understand this would require a court hearing where Maria could show up and contest everything. The thought of facing Maria in a courtroom made my stomach twist into knots. Bailey explained the judge would review all the evidence and decide whether Maria posed enough of a threat to justify the order. I asked what happened if the judge said no, and Bailey admitted that was possible, which made me feel sick. She said we needed to build the strongest case we could by gathering every single piece of evidence and organizing it into a clear timeline that showed Maria's behavior getting worse over time. I left her office with a list of things to collect and a court date circled on a calendar she gave me. The next week, I barely slept as I gathered everything Bailey needed. I printed out every bank alert and credit card fraud attempt notification, each one a reminder of how Maria tried to become me. I took screenshots of all her social media posts about being rejected by her birth family, the vague, threatening messages that never quite crossed the line into something police could act on immediately. Amy Hall from work wrote a statement about the phone call where someone pretended to be me asking for employment information. My parents came over one evening and sat at my kitchen table writing their own statements about the spare key incident and Maria's behavior when they confronted her. Mom cried the whole time she was writing, and Dad had to help her finish because her handwriting got too shaky to read. Bailey helped me organize everything into a timeline that started with our first meeting at the grocery store and ended with Maria's email threatening that I'd destroyed her only chance at family. Seeing it all laid out like that made the pattern obvious in a way that scared me. Each week, Maria had gotten bolder and more willing to cross boundaries until she was actively trying to steal my identity and replace me. Bailey made copies of everything and put it all in a thick folder with tabs marking each section. She said this was good work, and we had a solid case, but I needed to prepare myself for Maria to fight back hard. The night before we filed the petition, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and couldn't stop thinking about Maria's face when she got served with papers. Part of me kept remembering how excited she looked when we first met, how she cried when our parents apologized to her, how she laughed at Rachel's jokes and fit into my life so perfectly. I wondered if any of that was real, or if she was always planning this from the moment she saw me reaching for avocados. The grief felt like something heavy sitting on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I got up at 3 in the morning and sat on the couch in the dark, trying not to wake Amaya. I kept thinking about the sister relationship I imagined we'd have, all the years of memories we could have made together if things were different. But I also knew that version of Maria probably never existed outside my desperate hope for family. The Maria who planned to steal my life was the real one, and I needed to accept that and protect myself even if it hurt. We filed the petition at the courthouse the next morning, and I felt like I might throw up the whole time we waited in line. The clerk was an older woman with kind eyes who processed our paperwork and explained that Maria would be served with a temporary order and a hearing date within a few days. She said the temporary order would go into effect immediately once Maria was served, requiring her to stay away from me. Bailey walked me out to the parking lot after and put her hand on my shoulder. She told me Maria would likely be angry and unpredictable when she received the papers, so I needed to be extra careful about my safety for the next few weeks. She said to vary my routes, stay in public places, and call police immediately if Maria tried to contact me or show up anywhere near me. I drove home taking a different route than usual and checked my rearview mirror the whole way. 2 days later, my phone rang with an unknown number and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It went straight to voicemail, and Maria's voice came through the speaker, calm and cold in a way that made my skin crawl. She said I'd regret making this legal and that I had no idea what she was capable of doing when someone backed her into a corner. Her voice never got loud or emotional, just steady and controlled like she was reading from a script, which somehow made it more frightening. I saved the voicemail immediately with my hands shaking so hard I almost deleted it by accident. I forwarded it to Detective Browning and Bailey both, then sat on my couch listening to it 3 more times trying to understand the barely contained rage underneath her calm words. There was something about the way she said, "No idea what I'm capable of," that made me think she'd been planning this threat carefully, choosing each word to sound just threatening enough without crossing into something clearly illegal. Detective Browning called me back within an hour and asked me to come to the station for a follow-up interview. He listened to the voicemail twice on his computer, with his face getting more serious each time. He said this could potentially support criminal harassment charges now, but he wanted to wait and see what happened at the restraining order hearing before deciding whether to pursue that. He told me he was increasing patrols near my apartment and workplace as a precaution, which should have made me feel safer, but instead just confirmed how real the danger was. I went home and locked every window and door, then checked them all again twice before I could even think about relaxing. My mother called the next evening crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She said Maria had shown up at their house that afternoon screaming about the restraining order and pounding on the front door, so hard the neighbors came out to see what was happening. Maria was yelling that they needed to make me drop it, that I was destroying her life just like they did when they gave her away. My parents called the police and officers came and escorted Maria away from the property, with a warning about trespassing. Mom said watching police lead Maria to her car broke her heart into pieces because it felt like losing her daughter all over again. I told Mom I was sorry, but I had to protect myself, and she said she understood even though I could hear in her voice that part of her wished I would just let Maria back in and pretend everything was fine. Dad got on the phone and said they supported my decision to get the restraining order, and they wouldn't let Maria back in their house until this was all resolved. A few days later, I was in the apartment kitchen making dinner when I looked out the window and saw what I thought was Maria's car parked across the street. My chest got tight and my vision went fuzzy around the edges. I couldn't breathe right and my hands started tingling. Amaya found me sitting on the floor with my back against the cabinets trying to remember how to breathe normally. She sat down next to me and talked me through breathing exercises, counting out loud until my heart stopped racing quite so fast. When I could finally talk again, I told her about the car and she went to look, but it was gone by then, or maybe it was never Maria's car at all. Amaya said I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at shadows and having panic attacks every time I saw a car that looked familiar. She suggested I stay with Rachel for a few days before the hearing, just to feel safer and get some actual sleep. I packed a bag that night and drove to Rachel's apartment, checking my mirrors the whole way to make sure nobody was following me. Rachel had already set up her spare room for me with new locks on the bedroom door and her baseball bat leaning against the wall nearby. It felt ridiculous and sad that I was hiding from my own twin sister like she was some kind of dangerous stranger. But Rachel hugged me tight and said my safety mattered more than pride or how silly the precautions seemed. I spent the next week at Rachel's place barely leaving except for work, and even then Rachel or Amaya would walk me to my car. The restraining order hearing finally arrived on a cold Tuesday morning that made my bones ache. I sat in the courtroom with Bailey next to me, organizing papers, while Maria sat across the aisle with a public defender she apparently got appointed. Seeing her face in that setting made everything feel surreal and wrong. She looked exactly like me, but her expression was hard and angry in a way I'd never seen in my own mirror. The fluorescent lights made us both look washed out and tired. I kept thinking about how we shared the same DNA, grew in the same womb, but ended up as strangers sitting on opposite sides of a courtroom ready to fight each other. The bailiff called my name and I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like they might give out. Bailey stood near the judge's bench organizing papers while I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth. My voice came out steadier than I expected as I started walking through the timeline from that day in the produce section when I first saw Maria's face. I described how we became close, how she moved into my apartment, how I trusted her with everything about my life and my parents' routines. When I got to the part about overhearing her phone call through the window, my voice started shaking. I had to stop and take a breath before I could continue describing what she said about becoming me and taking back the 23 years she thought were stolen from her. Bailey played the recording I'd made, and the courtroom went completely silent except for Maria's voice coming through the speakers talking about my signatures and my parents' medications and how she'd soon have the wrong daughter. I looked across at Maria while her words filled the room, and she stared back at me with eyes so cold they didn't look like mine anymore. Her lawyer was writing notes fast, his pen scratching across the paper, and I could see him underlining certain words. Bailey asked me about the bank login attempts, and I pulled out the printed alerts showing someone tried to access my accounts 3 different times. Then she asked about the credit card fraud, and I explained how the company called me about suspicious charges at stores I'd never been to. My hands were shaking, so bad I had to set the papers down on the little ledge in front of me. When Bailey asked me to describe how all this made me feel, I said I couldn't sleep anymore, and I jumped every time I saw someone who looked like me, and I was scared to go to my own parents' house because I didn't know if she'd be there. The judge was watching me carefully and writing his own notes. Bailey thanked me and sat down. Then Maria's public defender stood up for cross-examination. He asked if maybe I misunderstood the phone call or took it out of context, and I said no. I heard exactly what she said, and I had it recorded. He suggested that maybe I was jealous of Maria getting attention from our parents after being an only child my whole life, and I felt my face get hot. I told him I was the one who brought Maria to meet our parents. I was the one who welcomed her into my apartment. I gave her a spare key to my parents' house because I trusted her. He kept pushing, asking if maybe Maria was just venting to a friend and didn't actually mean any of it, but I pointed out the bank login attempts and credit card fraud that happened after that phone call. He finally sat down looking frustrated, and the judge called for a short break. When we came back, Maria took the stand and I had to sit there watching her swear to tell the truth with my own hand and my own face. Her lawyer asked her to explain her side and she started crying right away, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She said she'd spent her whole life wondering about her birth family, and when she finally found us, she thought it was a dream come true. Then she said I started acting weird and possessive, like I couldn't handle sharing our parents with her after having them to myself for 23 years. She claimed the phone call I recorded was just her venting to a friend about feeling left out and unwelcome, that she never actually planned to do anything. When her lawyer asked about the bank and credit card attempts, she said she had no idea what I was talking about, and maybe someone else was trying to steal my identity. She looked right at me with tears running down her face and said it broke her heart that I would make up these accusations just because I was jealous. She said all she ever wanted was a sister and a family, and I was destroying that because I couldn't handle not being the center of attention anymore. Her voice got stronger as she talked, less shaky and more confident, and I could see she actually believed her own story. She said the adoption agency told her our parents were teenagers who couldn't keep her, and finding out they chose to keep me instead had been devastating. But she claimed she never wanted to hurt anyone. She just wanted to be part of the family she'd been denied her whole life. When she finished, her lawyer sat down looking pleased with himself, and I felt sick to my stomach. Bailey stood up for cross-examination and pulled out the bank alerts, asking Maria to explain why the login attempts happened from her phone's IP address. Maria's face changed, getting harder, and she said maybe her phone got hacked. Bailey asked about the credit card applications that used Maria's email address, and Maria said that didn't prove anything. Then Bailey played the voicemail Maria left me after being served with the restraining order papers, the one where her voice was cold and calm, saying I'd regret making this legal, and I had no idea what she was capable of. Maria's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed it as evidence of ongoing behavior. Bailey asked Maria to explain what she meant by that message, and Maria's composure started cracking. She said I was twisting everything, that she was just upset and saying things she didn't mean. Bailey kept pushing, asking about specific details from the phone call I overheard, and Maria got more and more defensive. Her voice got louder and her face turned red as she insisted I was lying about everything. She started gesturing with her hands, nearly yelling that this was all unfair, and I was the one harassing her by following her around and recording her private conversations. The judge told her to calm down, but she kept going, saying I was jealous and vindictive and trying to steal her chance at having a family. Bailey just stood there calmly letting Maria dig herself deeper with every angry word. Finally, Maria's lawyer stood up and asked for a moment to speak with his client, and when they finished whispering, Maria was quieter, but you could still see the rage in her eyes. Bailey had no more questions, and Maria walked back to her seat staring at me the whole way. The judge called my parents next, and I watched them walk to the stand together, my mother's face already wet with tears. My father went first, and his voice was steady, but quiet as he described giving Maria the spare key because she said she wanted to surprise us with breakfast. He explained how we confronted her about the phone call, and she gave the key back but denied everything. The judge asked if he believed Maria's explanation, and my father was quiet for a long moment before he said no. He didn't. He said Maria's reaction when confronted was defensive and angry rather than confused or hurt like you'd expect from someone falsely accused. My mother took the stand after him and could barely get through her testimony without breaking down. She kept apologizing to both me and Maria, saying she never wanted any of this to happen. She described how Maria had been asking detailed questions about their schedules and medications, always seeming so interested and caring, but now those questions felt sinister looking back. When Bailey asked if she felt unsafe having Maria know so much about their routines and home, my mother nodded and said yes. She said it killed her to admit it, but she was scared of what Maria might do with all that information. My father kept his eyes down the whole time my mother testified, his hands clenched together in his lap. When they finished and walked back to their seats, my mother was crying, so hard she could barely see where she was going. The judge took a few minutes to review all the evidence and testimony, shuffling through papers while the whole courtroom sat in tense silence. Then he looked up and said he was granting a restraining order for 1 year, based on the pattern of behavior and evidence presented. He said Maria had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, my workplace, and my parents' house at all times. Maria's face went completely white and then red, her mouth opening in shock. She stood up fast, her chair scraping loud against the floor, and started shouting that this wasn't fair. She said the judge was believing lies and I was the one who should be restrained for stalking her and recording her. Her lawyer grabbed her arm trying to pull her back down, but she yanked away from him. The judge banged his gavel and told her to sit down immediately, or he'd hold her in contempt. Maria finally sat, but she was shaking with rage, staring at me like she wanted to physically hurt me. The judge finished reading the terms of the order and said any violation would result in immediate arrest. He dismissed the court, and the bailiff came over to give Maria her copy of the order. I could see her hands trembling as she took the papers. Bailey and I gathered our things quickly and headed for the exit, but I couldn't help looking back at Maria one more time. Through the courtroom windows, I could see into the parking lot where Maria was sitting in her car with her head down on the steering wheel. Her shoulders were shaking and I knew she was crying. For just a second, I felt this pull to go out there and comfort her, to try one more time to fix this broken thing between us. Bailey must have seen me hesitate because she put her hand on my arm and steered me firmly toward my car instead. She said compassion was good, but it didn't mean I had to sacrifice my own safety. She reminded me that Maria had made choices that led to this moment, that the restraining order existed because Maria's behavior was dangerous. I nodded and got in my car, watching through my mirrors as Bailey drove away first. Maria was still in her car crying, and part of me wanted to believe those tears meant she was sorry, that maybe this would be the wake-up call she needed. But I remembered the cold look in her eyes during testimony and the rage on her face when the judge granted the order, and I knew better than to trust those tears. The next day, I was at work trying to focus on normal tasks when Detective Browning called. He said the prosecutor had reviewed all the testimony and evidence from the hearing and was now considering filing criminal charges against Maria for attempted identity theft and harassment. I felt my stomach drop because even though I knew it might be necessary, the idea of another court process exhausted me. Browning explained that the restraining order was civil protection, but criminal charges would mean real consequences if Maria was convicted, including possible jail time and a permanent record. He said the prosecutor wanted to meet with me to discuss whether I wanted to move forward with pressing charges. I asked how long that process would take, and he said probably several months minimum, with investigations and court dates and possibly a trial if Maria didn't take a plea deal. I told him I needed to think about it and talk to Bailey, and he said that was fine, but to let him know soon because they needed to move quickly if they were going to file charges. After I hung up, I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen without seeing anything, trying to process the idea of going through all of this again. That evening, I had my regular appointment with Brianna, and I broke down completely as soon as I sat on her couch. All the stress and fear and grief I'd been holding in during the hearing came pouring out, and I cried so hard I couldn't catch my breath. Brianna handed me tissues and waited patiently while I sobbed about losing the sister I thought I'd found and the family healing I'd hoped for when Maria first appeared in my life. She said it was healthy and necessary to grieve those losses, even while protecting myself from who Maria actually turned out to be. I told her I kept thinking about that moment in the produce section when we first saw each other, how shocked and happy we both were, and how quickly everything turned dark. Brianna helped me understand that I could mourn the relationship I wanted, the twin connection I'd dreamed of my whole childhood, while still accepting that Maria was too damaged and dangerous to have in my life. She said grief wasn't linear, and I might feel sad and angry and relieved all at the same time, and that was normal. We talked about the criminal charges decision, and she said only I could decide if I had the emotional energy for another legal battle, but that my safety had to come first regardless. By the end of the session, I felt wrung out but slightly better, like crying had released some of the pressure building up inside me. My mother called a few days later and told me she and Dad had started seeing a marriage counselor because everything with Maria had brought up decades of unresolved guilt and pain about the adoption. She said the stress was affecting their relationship in ways they couldn't handle alone anymore. I asked how it was going, and there was a long pause before she admitted it was really hard. She said in their first session my father had finally admitted out loud that giving Maria away was ultimately his decision, that my mother had wanted to find a way to keep both of us, but he'd insisted they couldn't manage it financially or emotionally. My mother's voice shook as she told me she'd resented him for that choice ever since, even though she'd never said it directly until now. She said part of why she'd been so eager to welcome Maria and make up for lost time was because she was trying to ease her own guilt about not fighting harder to keep her. I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to process my parents' marriage problems on top of everything else. My mother said they were committed to working through it, but it was going to take time, and she wanted me to know in case their relationship seemed strained when I saw them. I told her I understood, and that I was glad they were getting help, even though part of me was angry that their old decisions were still causing damage 23 years later. A few days after that, I got a call from Mohammed Ahmed at the adoption agency. He said Maria had been contacting them repeatedly over the past week, demanding access to her complete adoption file and making accusations about illegal adoption practices. His voice was careful and professional as he assured me that everything about Maria's adoption had been completely legal and properly documented. But he said Maria seemed to be spiraling, looking for someone or something to blame for how her life turned out. He'd tried to explain to her that the adoption was closed and they'd followed all proper procedures, but she kept insisting there must be something wrong with the paperwork, or some evidence that our parents had done something illegal. Mohammed said he was calling to warn me that Maria appeared to be in a bad mental state and might try to contact me despite the restraining order. He suggested I keep being vigilant about my safety and document anything suspicious. I thanked him for the warning and hung up feeling that familiar anxiety creeping back in. The restraining order was supposed to make me feel safer, but knowing Maria was out there spiraling and looking for someone to blame just made everything worse. 2 days after Mohammed's warning, I got a message request on Facebook from someone named Fraser. Her profile picture showed her holding a golden retriever puppy, and her bio said she worked at the same animal shelter as Maria. My stomach dropped before I even opened the message. She wrote that she was worried about Maria and wanted to know if I'd heard from her, because Maria hadn't shown up for work in 2 weeks and wasn't answering anyone's calls or texts. She said the shelter manager was about to report her as a missing person if someone didn't hear from her soon. I stared at the message for a long time, my hands shaking, before I typed back a careful response explaining that I had a restraining order against Maria and couldn't help. I suggested she contact the police if she was genuinely concerned for Maria's welfare, but I couldn't get involved in any way. Emily responded almost immediately, saying she understood and didn't want to put me in a bad position, but then she added something that made my blood run cold. She said that before Maria disappeared, she'd been talking obsessively at work about getting back what was stolen from her, and how some people deserve to lose everything they had. Emily said she hadn't thought much of it at the time because Maria was always dramatic, but now she was wondering if she should have said something sooner. I thanked her for letting me know and screenshot our entire conversation, then forwarded it to Detective Browning with shaking hands. Detective Browning called me within an hour of getting my message. He said he'd do a welfare check at Maria's apartment right away, and asked me to stay alert, but not to panic yet. I spent the rest of that day unable to focus on anything, checking my phone every few minutes for updates. When Detective Browning finally called back that evening, his voice was serious in a way that made my chest tight. He said Maria's apartment was mostly empty when he got there, with the landlord telling him she'd broken her lease suddenly 3 days ago and moved out in the middle of the night. There was no forwarding address, no information about where she went, and she'd left behind some furniture and personal items like she'd left in a hurry. The landlord said Maria had paid a penalty to break the lease early and seemed agitated when she came to turn in her keys. Detective Browning said this made everyone nervous because now we had no idea where Maria was or what she might be planning. He increased patrols near my apartment and my parents' house as a precaution and told me to call 911 immediately if I saw her anywhere. For the next 2 weeks, I lived in constant anxiety that made it hard to breathe normally. I jumped at shadows and checked over my shoulder constantly when I walked to my car. Every time I saw someone with dark hair like ours, my heart would start racing until I got close enough to see it wasn't her. I couldn't sleep more than a few hours at a time because I kept waking up convinced I'd heard someone trying my door. Amaya started sleeping with her bedroom door locked after I told her what was happening, and I felt guilty for bringing this danger into her life. Rachel came over most nights to keep me company, and we'd sit on the couch watching stupid TV shows while I tried not to think about where Maria might be. My parents called every day to check on me, their voices tight with worry, and I could hear the guilt eating at them through the phone. Detective Browning kept me updated on the investigation, and after a week he told me the prosecutor had decided to file criminal charges for attempted identity theft, even though Maria wasn't around. He explained this meant a warrant would be issued for her arrest, so if she was found anywhere in the country, police could pick her up and bring her back to face charges. The idea of Maria out there somewhere, angry and unpredictable, with a warrant for her arrest made everything feel more dangerous and real. On day 13 of not knowing where Maria was, Detective Browning called with news about another discovery. He said a guy named Alan Lopez, who also worked at the animal shelter with Maria, had contacted him with disturbing information. Alan had gone to Maria's old apartment to help the landlord clean it out for the next tenant, and when he was pulling off old posters and decorations, he found something behind them on one wall. Detective Browning's voice got quieter as he described what Alan had found. The entire wall of Maria's bedroom had been covered in photos of me, our parents, and my apartment building. There were pictures of me walking to my car, getting coffee, sitting in my office at work that must have been taken through the window. Some of the photos had dates and times written on them in Maria's handwriting, like she'd been keeping a log of my daily routines and schedules. There were photos of our parents' house from different angles, pictures of their cars, even some shots that looked like they'd been taken from inside their house during one of Maria's visits. Alan said it was like something from a crime show, and he'd felt sick to his stomach when he realized what he was looking at. Detective Browning asked me to come to the station to look at the photos as evidence for the criminal case. I drove there with Rachel because I couldn't handle going alone, and we sat in a small interview room while Detective Browning spread out dozens of printed photos on the table. Seeing images of myself that I never knew existed made me feel violated in a way I couldn't describe. There was a photo of me standing in my kitchen visible through my apartment window, one of me pumping gas at the station near my work, another of me and Rachel having lunch at our favorite cafe. Maria had been watching me for weeks, maybe months, documenting my entire life without me knowing. Some photos had notes written on the back about what I was wearing or who I was with or what time of day it was. There was a whole series of photos showing the route I took to work each morning, like she'd been studying my patterns to know exactly where I'd be and when. Detective Browning pointed out that several photos were taken after I'd asked Maria for space, which meant she'd ignored my request and actually increased her surveillance of me. I felt my hands start shaking as I looked through them, and Rachel had to take over because I couldn't keep holding the photos without dropping them. The photos gave the prosecutor additional evidence for the criminal case, and proved that Maria's behavior had been planned and obsessive for much longer than anyone realized. Detective Browning explained that this level of surveillance showed premeditation, which would make the charges more serious if Maria was ever caught. He said the photos confirmed that Maria's obsession went way deeper than normal twin curiosity, or even justified anger about the adoption. This was dangerous fixation that had been building for a long time, probably since before we even met in the grocery store that day. I wondered if Maria had actually been following me before our supposed chance meeting, if she'd engineered that whole encounter to seem random when really she'd been watching me for weeks. The thought made me feel sick and stupid for believing her story about being shocked to see me. Detective Browning made copies of all the photos for the case file and told me to keep the originals in a safe place in case we needed them later. I took them home in a manila envelope that I shoved in the back of my closet because I couldn't stand to look at them anymore. I had to tell my parents about the photo wall, and I drove to their house that evening to show them some of the pictures. My mother's face went completely white when she saw the photos of me taken without my knowledge, and my father looked like he might be sick. They kept saying they were so sorry, that they never imagined Maria would do something like this, that they should have believed me sooner when I said she was dangerous. My mother started crying and apologizing for not taking the situation seriously enough after the restraining order, for still holding on to hope that Maria just needed time and understanding. She said seeing the photos made her realize that Maria's behavior had gone way beyond normal pain about being given up for adoption, that this was obsessive and scary in a way she couldn't ignore anymore. My father admitted he'd been in denial because accepting that Maria was dangerous meant accepting that their decision to give her away had somehow created this person who wanted to hurt me. But looking at the evidence of how Maria had been stalking me, he couldn't pretend anymore that this was just a family misunderstanding we could work through. We sat at their kitchen table for hours that night, and for the first time since this all started, I felt like my parents were actually on my side, instead of trying to protect Maria's feelings. My mother reached across the table and held my hand while she apologized again, and I felt something tight in my chest start to loosen a little bit. We were finally on the same page about how serious this was, and that made me feel less alone in dealing with it. 3 months after the restraining order was issued, Detective Browning called me on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for work. He said Maria had been found in Arizona and arrested on the warrant. She'd been living under a fake name and working at a different animal shelter there, but someone had recognized her from a missing person report that Amelie had filed weeks ago. The Arizona police picked her up and she was being held there until she could be brought back to our state to face the criminal charges. Detective Browning said the process of bringing her back would take a few weeks because of paperwork and court procedures, but I should prepare myself for the trial that would happen once she returned. He gave me Bailey's number again, and suggested I call her to start preparing for what would come next. I called Bailey that same day, and she explained that I'd probably need to testify at the trial, and that she could help me write a victim impact statement about how Maria's actions had affected my sense of safety and ability to trust people. She said these statements were important because they helped judges understand the real harm that crimes caused beyond just the legal violations. Over the next few weeks, Bailey and I met several times to work on my statement, and writing it all down made me realize just how much damage Maria had done to my mental health and my relationships. Maria was brought back to our state in early October and her trial was scheduled for November. But a week before the trial date, Bailey called to tell me that Maria's lawyer had worked out a plea deal with the prosecutor. Maria would plead guilty to attempted identity theft and harassment in exchange for a sentence of 3 years probation, mandatory mental health treatment, and restitution to cover all the costs I'd had from changing locks, legal fees, and therapy bills. Bailey explained that Maria wouldn't have to serve any jail time as long as she followed all the rules of her probation and completed the required treatment program. I felt frustrated and angry that Maria was getting off so easy after everything she'd done, after the months of fear and anxiety she'd caused me and my family. Bailey could hear it in my voice and explained that this outcome actually had some benefits. She said that if we went to trial, there was always a chance Maria could be found not guilty or get an even lighter sentence, and a trial would drag everything out for months more. The plea deal guaranteed that Maria would face consequences and be required to get mental health help, which she clearly needed. It also meant Maria would be monitored closely by a probation officer for 3 years, so if she violated any terms or tried to contact me, she'd face immediate jail time. Bailey said this was actually a pretty good result, given how hard these kinds of cases usually were to prosecute. The sentencing hearing happened on a cold morning in mid-November, and I sat in the courtroom with my parents on one side and Rachel and Bailey on the other. Maria was brought in wearing regular clothes instead of jail orange, and seeing her face after months of not knowing where she was made my heart start racing. She looked thinner and tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but her expression was blank and cold. The judge went through all the formal parts of accepting the plea deal, asking Maria questions about whether she understood what she was agreeing to, and whether anyone had forced her to take the deal. Maria answered in a flat voice that didn't sound like the sister I'd met in the grocery store all those months ago. Then the judge asked if Maria wanted to say anything before sentencing, and Maria's lawyer handed her a piece of paper. She read from it in the same flat tone, saying she was sorry for any distress she'd caused, and that she recognized her behavior had been inappropriate. She said she'd been struggling with mental health issues related to grief over losing her adoptive parents and learning about being given up at birth. The apology sounded rehearsed and hollow, like someone had written it for her, and she was just reading the words without meaning them. She never looked at me or my parents the whole time she was talking, just kept her eyes on the paper in her hands. When she finished, she sat down without any emotion on her face at all. The judge accepted the plea deal and sentenced Maria to 3 years supervised probation, with mandatory mental health treatment and restitution payments. He added a special condition that Maria was to have absolutely no contact with me, my parents, or anyone in my family for 5 years, which was even longer than the original restraining order. He said if Maria violated the no-contact order or any other terms of her probation, she would be immediately sent to jail to serve a 2-year sentence. He looked right at Maria when he said this, his voice serious, and told her that she was getting a chance to get help and turn her life around, but he wouldn't tolerate any more harassment or obsessive behavior. Maria nodded once but didn't say anything. As the bailiff led her out of the courtroom to process her release, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I'd been carrying for months. There were finally real consequences for what she'd done, and I had legal protection that would last for years. My mother was crying next to me, but this time they were tears of relief instead of guilt. My father squeezed my shoulder as we stood up to leave, and for the first time since I'd seen my own face staring back at me across the produce section, I felt like maybe I could start to feel safe again. A few weeks after the hearing, my mom called to tell me about a family therapist named Usha Morales, who wanted to set up a group meeting with all of us once Maria finished her treatment program. She said everyone would have to agree to it first, and that Usha thought it might help us all move forward together. I told my mom I wasn't ready to even think about that yet, and hung up feeling anxious about the whole idea. When I brought it up in my next session with Brianna, she said I was allowed to focus on my own healing first, and that I didn't owe anyone a timeline for forgiveness or reconciliation. She reminded me that protecting my peace was more important than making other people comfortable, and I felt the weight lift off my shoulders knowing I had permission to say no. 6 months passed and I started feeling more like myself again, though I still had moments where the whole thing hit me out of nowhere. My parents and I went to family therapy together every other week, working through all the complicated feelings about their choice to give Maria away and how it affected everyone. We talked about things we'd never discussed before, and I understood them better even if I couldn't change what happened. I started seeing someone I met through Rachel who knew the whole story from the beginning and didn't treat me like I was broken or fragile. We took things slow, and I learned that I could trust people again even after everything. Sometimes I wondered what Maria was doing and if the therapy was actually helping her, but mostly I focused on rebuilding my sense of safety and moving forward with my life. The restraining order would expire in 6 more months, and I'd have to decide whether to renew it or maybe try supervised contact. But right now, I was okay with the distance and the peace it brought me.